Welcome to another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson. I am the founder of Teach the Geek. I work with technical professionals so they can present more effectively, especially in front of non-technical audiences. You can learn more about it at teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Today, my guest is Dan Dumbacher. He's the executive director of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, AIAA. You don't come out of school becoming with dreams of becoming an executive director. So I assume that there's other things that he did certainly before he got to the position that he's in. And definitely held a number of positions before this one. So I'm interested to learn more about his beginnings in engineering and his transition to work as an administrator. Welcome to Teach the Geek interviews, Dan.
Oh, thank you for having me, Neil. Looking forward to it. This is great.
Great, wonderful. So from the bit of research I did on you, I saw that you studied mechanical engineering. What was the motivation to study that?
I always wanted to go work in the space program growing up. At the time I was in school, the hiring potential for aerospace engineers was a little bit questionable. And so I realized that I could do mechanical engineering and go to aerospace, and I would have a backup plan if I didn't get an aerospace job.
It's interesting you mentioned that, Dan, because I actually interviewed someone who works at NASA. So that interview hasn't come out yet. It likely will in the next few weeks. And he studied space science in school, and he wanted to work at NASA, but they weren't hiring. He actually had to wait 5.5 years before he finally got a job there. And he did a whole bunch of different odd jobs in that 5.5 years before he ended up getting that job at NASA. So I don't know. I think you had a better plan. If this doesn't work out, there's someone else I can go.
Well, and I was lucky. I had 2 summer internships at the Marshall Space Flight Center at NASA before I ever graduated. So it was all good.
Oh, nice. All right. So now you get this degree in mechanical engineering. What'd you do next?
Well, I went to work at NASA. And was lucky enough to be working on the shuttle program before the first shuttle flight as a summer student. Did NASA for about 3.5, 4 years. Then I went off to missile defense for a little bit, realized I wanted to get back into civil space, came back to NASA, and then stayed at NASA for the remainder of 33 years.
Wow. That's 33. That's a long time to be at one company. What kept you there?
The mission, actually. The idea, I always wanted to work on space exploration of any kind, and I had the opportunity to work in human space flight on the shuttle program, flight test projects that actually did vertical landing before others did it back in the mid-90s. Got to do some other things, developing new launch vehicle technology. Had the opportunity to work on what's now X-37 that the Air Force has. It actually started as a NASA program. And then, long story short, engineering director at the Marshall Space Flight Center. And then I got called to NASA headquarters to handle the transition from the Constellation program to what we now call Artemis. So my job was helping get the Space Launch System in Orion up and running.
Nice. I like it when people make long stories short. They're easier to follow. That's wonderful. So, I did mention in the intro that you're the executive director of AIAA. What motivated your transition into administration?
Well, there's actually a step between that's part of the story. And
okay.
When I retired from NASA, I went to teach systems engineering at Purdue University. And while I was there, having a great time with the students and helping them get prepared for the future, AIAA called one day and said, "How would you like to do this?" And 2 things happened. Number one, I realized that it was an opportunity for me to help students in the next generation in a larger way. And number 2, there was a family aspect to this with AIAA's offices being near Washington, D.C., out in Reston, Virginia. And when you have a couple of children and potential grandchildren in the Washington, D.C. area, it's kind of straightforward.
Nice. Oh, well, excellent. You got to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Got a cool job and be close to family. What's not to like? What's not to like about that? So
right.
Now you've worked you taught systems engineering, and then you worked at NASA for all these years. How did those previous experiences prepare you for the work you do now with AIAA?
Well, lots of things. The work over time, you get to learn the industry, you get to learn what's important to the industry and how the industry operates, the good and the bad, living through things like Challenger and Columbia, and a few other smaller scale failures. You learn what is needed and you learn what works. And one of the key things I learned is that the technical degree, the technical acumen is obviously part and party to this, and it is not sufficient. Working with people is the key. Everything takes a team. You don't do anything in the aerospace business by one individual. It takes a team everywhere from the scientists and engineers to the business people, to the legal people, to the administrative assistants, to the HR people. It's all part of a team and working with people. And the one thing you learn very quickly is that you have to be able to work with individuals from different backgrounds. And the number one skill you have to be able to do with them is to be able to communicate, not just talking to them, but also actively listening, so that it's a true communication process. And if you do that, good things happen, and you can help the team be successful, and then the mission is accomplished. So all good.
Yeah, I definitely take your point about the importance of developing those softer skills as opposed, in addition to those technical skills. Engineering schools certainly prepare us with those technical skills, but then, as you mentioned, you get into a company now, or any organization like NASA or just a company, you're working in teams. I worked in teams working in medical devices, and not all of them were engineers. A lot of them, and actually, in one of the companies I worked at, it was a new group that I joined. So no one really else at the company knew what we were working on. So there was a lot of education that we had to do during these presentations to just even let them know what are we talking about. It was so important for us to do, because if we didn't, then we'd get what would end up happening, especially when I used to have to give project status updates, is I'd get questions afterwards that I thought I had answered during the presentation. But because I didn't put things in a way that the people in the audience can understand, now I'm getting these questions, and and I'll say that when I first started giving presentations, I wasn't very good at it. And at the end of these presentations, having to answer these questions, I realized why. And you thought I would have gotten better at it over time, but I was stubborn.
I applaud you, Neil, for even recognizing that you needed to go back and improve, because one of the lessons I learned early on is this is a never-ending improvement process, because every audience is different. You have to be able to work with the various different audiences and the various different perspectives, and be able to address and account and understand those perspectives. And it's all because, just like you said, it's about getting that interaction and knowledge transfer and communication with other individuals, and you have to meet people where they are, so that things can move forward. And that's one of those challenges. I will tell you, they did not teach us this in engineering school.
No, okay, I guess I'm not a unicorn then. I knew I wasn't though. Yeah, absolutely. And
that one communications class your freshman year, I don't know. I think a lot of people forget it. The one thing I remember out of that is there's a feedback loop, and you better account for it. And that's listening to others.
Yeah, 100%. I think when it comes down to it, it comes down to just having empathy for the audience, because you have this technical expertise, and sometimes you forget that they don't. So there's going to be things that and you just think it's obvious, but it's not obvious to the people who don't work in it every day. So you have to explain things in a way that they can actually take in and understand. And not only that, but a lot of the times, the people that you might be talking to, these are decision makers. So you really need to make them understand, because if they don't, then the answer is no.
Well, and you have to help them understand. You have to help, and you have to take the value of their input, because this is a two-way street. We do any of the technical stuff we do today, more and more has societal, economic, policy impacts, and you have to be able to work through that and address it.
Yeah, no question. Dan, you mentioned that that you were a professor of systems engineering at Purdue. But from the research I did on you, I saw that you were a professor of practice. I've never seen that term before. So what does professor of practice mean?
That means you're not tenured, um, which actually has its benefits. No, it's a way that a lot of the universities, the medical schools have done this a lot. They call them clinical professors, and they bring them in from the industry, and I use that term rather widely. And so in my case, I did not have an academic career. And Purdue, Professor Leah Jameson at the time was the dean of engineering, and she very purposely was working to put professors of practice in the different engineering schools so that the students had the technical foundation that came from all the tenured faculty, and that outside of academia industry perspective that would help the students be better prepared when they left the university as either an undergrad, grad, PhD student.
Okay, that makes perfect sense, because whether they like it or not, that's where most of them are going to end up. I've had a number of guests on the podcast who were professors, and we often talk about the people getting into these PhD programs and thinking they're going to be tenured track professors, but there aren't enough positions for these people who end up getting these degrees. So where do they go? Well, they got to go work in industry. And do the schools prepare them enough for going into those industry jobs? Are you good with working in teams as a PhD student? As someone who has a PhD, you better be, or you better learn, because that's what you're going to be doing when you're in industry. And not only that, but when you're doing a PhD, you're focused on something that's very specific. But once you get into industry, you may be working on a number of things, and you better be open-minded enough to not just want to focus on the one thing, or on one particular thing. And not only that, but Dan, I've had also conversations with some of these people. PhDs take as long as they take, but when you're in industry, there's a time limit, man. We need this product launched by this next trade show, so you don't have all the time in the world to just think about all the various aspects of a particular project.
Oh, and by the way, there's a budget too.
That too. Absolutely, 100%. There's constraints that you have to deal with that maybe you never considered before, but hey, you'll learn eventually.
Right? Yeah, whether you like it or not.
Indeed. Dan, when I first started this podcast, it was based on my own struggles having to give presentations in front of management. I mentioned earlier that I used to have to give presentations, and I wasn't very good at it at first, but eventually I saw the benefit of it. When did you see the benefit of getting better at giving presentations, or public speaking in general?
Well, that's an interesting question, because something prompted me in high school. Was it high school? I can't even remember. Ooh, that's scary. Something prompted me. I think, my father was an engineer, and I kind of watched his contemporaries, and I learned from that there was a communication skill needed for some strange reason that I cannot remember. I actually remember jumping into a speech competition where the Rotary Club or something like that. And I frankly, to be honest with you, used Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech as the for that competition. And I did it because I felt like, my mother and my father and others made the point that would be good practice. Fast forward to when I get out of engineering school and I show up at NASA, and as a new employee at the Marshall Space Flight Center, you were purposely put into what we called an intern training program. We had a professional intern program, PIP. And part of that was how to do a presentation, how to do other things. And you ultimately had to do, at the end of your 2 years, you had to do a presentation to the director of engineering. Now, that doesn't scare me now, because I used to have that job. But at the time I was a young engineer, that scared me. So I figured I better get ready. and along the way, my mentors, Bob Ryan in particular, and Otto Getz and a few others, they made it clear that even though you're doing a technical presentation and a technical discussion, you have to be able to tell the story. Human beings think in terms of stories. That's the way we've built up over the ages. That's the way our minds work. That's the way we process and learn and retain information and knowledge. And so you have to be able to tell a story. You just don't come in and regurgitate facts and let somebody try to figure it out. You have to help them understand how it all plays together. So with all of that kind of mixed up, I learned over time that I needed to do it. And my mentors and my bosses just kept throwing me in the fire, and I kept trying to make sure I didn't mess up.
But you're absolutely right, Dan, about the importance of telling a story. When I first started giving presentations, that was the furthest thing from my mind. I used to slap slides together, read them, and try to get out of there as quickly as possible, but I never got out of there as quickly as possible because, as I mentioned earlier, I'd get questions afterwards I thought I had answered. But the idea of telling stories is such an important one, especially to people who have a different background than you do. They may not even care that much about what you're talking about, but telling stories may very well help them care more.
Well, and I learned in particular, I learned that when I got moved to NASA headquarters for the last time, because there were multiple rotations through Washington, when I got in my final job and I was working very closely with Hill staff and other policymakers, other decision makers that did not have technical backgrounds, you had to be able to explain and discuss things in a way that, number one, helped share the knowledge and help bring them along, but you had to, everybody are their peers, they're equals in this conversation, and you have to be able to treat it that way. You can't come in with, well, I'm the technical guy, so I know more. That does not work. So we, I just learned, the other thing I learned is do not use acronyms. And because acronyms, they're actually off-putting to people, because what the message you're sending to people is, I've got my own language and therefore I'm better than you. And that's not the intent. Acronyms are generally done in order to shorten up time and shorten communication, although it can actually mean you miss things. That's a whole study unto itself. But the ability to, and it takes a lot of practice and it takes a lot of thinking, and you have to think through your messages and make sure your messages make sense and practice those messages, because when you're talking to others that don't even have the same background you do, you have to be able to describe it. And just because some people have an engineering degree doesn't mean they understand the story you're trying to explain. So it boils down to, you just have to realize that people are, the discussions come from different directions, and you have to be able to work with each other and talk with each other on an equal basis, because everybody's got perspectives. You have to account for those perspectives. You have to know your audience. You have to know where your audience is coming from, so that you can communicate better with them. And that's what it sounds easy. It's not nearly as easy as it should be. That's why there are communication professionals in this world. But I think over time you learn it to a point where it gets you good enough and long, kind of back to one of the questions you asked a minute ago. All that practice, all that learning along the way is key for a job like I have now as the executive director of AIAA, because fundamentally the job is a 95% people job. And you have to be able to, you have to work with your team, the volunteers, the members of the Institute, the people outside the Institute, the external stakeholders. It's a broad set.
Yeah, it certainly would sound like a people's job. And I think probably the number one question you probably have to ask yourself is, why should people care about what I'm talking about? I'm the head of the AIAA. Why should you care, external stakeholder? Why should you care, staff member? Why should you care, fill in the blank? It's especially we could listen to a lot of people. Why should we listen to you? And I don't think people really ask that question enough. What do you mean, why should you listen to me? Because I'm me. I'm important to you, but are you important to others?
Yeah, that's you just raised 2 points. Number one, the conversation around the why. That is key for people to understand the rest of the story. And you have to be able to put the ego away, off to the side, because like you said, why should they be spending their time listening to you? And you have to account for that in your thought process, and that means in large part put the ego aside and let's get down to the facts.
No question. Before you give a presentation, Dan, do you ever get nervous? And if so, how do you deal with your nerves?
I do. I've got one tomorrow, by the way. The way I deal with it, Neil, is it's about being prepared. I spent in another part of my life. I grew up in Indiana. If that tells you anything about this basketball thing that I use a lot.
Indeed, it does.
What it boils down to is, if you are prepared and you think through the possibilities, how the other people, what questions they might have, what is important to them in their role and in their position. And when you think all that through and you come in prepared, there will always be a level of nervousness because we're all, we're trying for perfection. But the nervousness mostly, it doesn't go away. It gets addressed by being as prepared as possible. And if you're prepared, and you've done all you can to prepare, from all the details to the upper level messages and everything in between, you should be okay.
Yeah. When it comes to nervousness, I know, at least the way I look at it is, if you don't care about what you're talking about, then you might not be as nervous. But if you actually care about the outcome of your presentation and what people take away from it, then you should be nervous. And it's normal to be nervous. It's just about how do you manage those nerves. And I think what you said about being prepared certainly helps.
Yeah, excellent point. That's you have to, if you don't care, you probably shouldn't be talking.
Indeed.
And that leads me to another key point. I think one of the things that I've always told people when it comes to presentations or job interviews or whatever it might be is let that passion come through. Don't try to hide it. Passion means a lot. It means you care. It means you're willing to go the extra mile. It means that you're willing to put in the extra work to achieve the mission goals that you're trying to achieve. And I always encourage people, particularly in job interviews, that sometimes those can be, like rote and everybody just kind of memorizes speeches and they come in and go, no. If the passion doesn't come through, you're not doing for you to be successful, you need to let the passion come through.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. And if you do that, well, then the people in the audience may think, okay, this person actually cares about what they're talking about. Maybe I should care about what they're talking about. I'll give them the time. I won't look at my phone. I won't fall asleep. I won't stare out into space. I'll actually listen to what they're talking about. Yeah, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, because this communication is a two-way street. It's broadcast and listening all at the same time.
100%. So if you were, for the people who are listening or watching our conversation, they want to get better at giving presentations or public speaking in general, what would your number one tip be?
Oh gosh, number one tip. I thought you might ask me for 5 or 10. Practice. Tip number 2, I'm going to cheat. Tip number 2 goes back to be prepared. Think it all through. Think through the various possibilities and the options. Just to help you make sure that your messages are as clear and as succinct and as understandable for the other party in the conversation as possible.
You know, Dan, you're not the first person to offer more than one tip when I asked that question. I think it's, you know what you all have in common? You all are the head people. So you're used to making the rules. It's like you asked me for one tip. Damn it, I'm giving you how many tips I want. I'm the head guy. What are you talking about?
I gave you one. I gave you one, and it was A, B, and C.
I want A, B, and C. All right. Well, that's what we'll go with. Well, Dan, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for being a guest. How can people get in touch with you?
Well, LinkedIn is easy. My email is danield@aiaa.org. But anybody wants to reach out through LinkedIn, just start. There aren't many Dumbachers on LinkedIn, I will tell you that, because every Dumbacher in the United States is related. So do a search and you'll find me, and reach out through LinkedIn. That's a good way. And then email danield@aiaa.org, and we can go from there.
Wonderful. Well, everyone, that marks the end of another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson, and I'm the founder of Teach the Geek. You can learn more about it at teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Until next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks, Dan.
Oh, glad to do it, Neil.